There's this guy whose theory for countries to get out of development is to lower fertility.
I mean, that's the controversial bit of the thesis. The thesis starts with, it's all about education. To simplify it the most, if you've got 5 or 6 kids, on a Friday night, you've got no money left. If you've got 2 to 3 kids on a Friday night, you have got money left. And if you do, you put a shilling, a naira, a few West African francs into the bank account, and the bank deposits start to grow. And as the bank deposits grow, interest rates come down, and then countries take off.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Welcome. Thank you, Charlie, for coming. We were actually introduced to you by Wilson, someone who talked to us about you, and he said there's this guy whose theory for countries to get out of development is to lower fertility. And we're like, what? And then apparently you had a talk here at SOAS and you ruffled some feathers, apparently.
Caused quite the kerfuffle.
So maybe we can jump right into it. What can you explain more the logic behind?
Yeah, well, that logic that's the controversial bit of the thesis. The thesis starts with, it's all about education. And in itself, if you've educated men and women to boys and girls up to a decent level, even of just basic literacy in any language, inevitably, actually, the fertility rate does decline a generation or 2 generations later. So education always comes first and development comes later. What I think's been missed in the development thinking and theorizing over the last, forever, actually, is interest rates. So I come from a investment banking background, and in investment banking, you're pricing shares or you're pricing bonds, and it's all about the interest rates, all about the return on money. Development economics, as I see it, is primarily what's the most effective way of giving away money to support growth. Very valuable work, not the work I've done, but super valuable. But they don't think, because they're giving away money, that's not about what's the return on my capital, how much profit can I make from this, what sort of interest rate are we playing with here? So when I started to look at development in Africa, which I did from an emerging market perspective, on the assumption that Africa was the last frontier market, this is the one that capital was eventually going to come to, and that's how I was getting paid to do this work. What struck me was how incredibly high interest rates are across Africa. And that I heard so many explanations for. It was greedy banks. Greedy banks pay you little on deposit. They end up paying really double-digit high interest rates when you get a loan from them. They're ripping you off. It's foreign investors. Foreign capital doesn't understand Africa. They price the risk wrong, and that's why they charge Africa such high interest rates. This isn't just Africa, by the way. This is Pakistan at the moment as well, Afghanistan, actually, if you wanted to invest there. Anyway, the multitude of reasons. It's foreign companies. They come in and asset strip a country. They take out the gold. They don't leave the profits back for the people of the local area, and that's why there's not enough money in the country. And this is why Africa's poor. And of course, not all of Africa. We're going to caveat this right through the conversation, but anyway, it's we'll go. So all of those reasons are partly true. By the way, there is an element of each of truth in all of that. But the biggest driver seems to be how big your bank deposits are in your economy. If you've got umpteen amounts of bank deposits in your economy, then your interest rates are very low. And that does happen in Africa. You see it in Mauritius, Morocco. Interest rates are, is it 1.75% now? 1.75. This is like a third of what the UK or the US is. It's incredibly low. Why are Moroccan interest rates so low? And I went to see the Moroccan chief economist of the central bank. I said, where are all these savings from? You've got 100% of GDP in savings. That's a huge amount of money. If I take another example, many Francophone countries in the West African region are more like 20%. So why is Morocco at 100%? And he said, it's because we stole all this money from Spain. 1492, they threw us out and we took it with us. Now, it turns out it's not as romantic a story as that. It's the fertility rate in Morocco went down below 3 kids in 1999. And when that happened, Moroccan families could save money. And you see this globally. And it's happened in every country in the world since 1750 and 1800 and the industrialization of Europe. It's all been about a falling fertility rate. So I will finish this very long answer, but to simplify it the most, if you've got 5 or 6 kids on a Friday night, you've got no money left. If you've got 2 to 3 kids on a Friday night, you have got money left. And if you do, you put a shilling, a naira, a few West African francs into the bank account, and the bank deposits start to grow. And as the bank deposits grow, interest rates come down, and then countries take off.
So essentially, you had a look and you said, okay, development in Africa is not happening because they have high interest rates. They're not able to get loans. And after some digging, you've realized that interest rate is linked to savings of the country. And then you dug a little further and found that has a relation to fertility. But I was wondering, is it kind of how do you know the cause or causation? Like, is it like, for example, education goes up, so fertility goes down? Or how do you know, okay, if we reduce fertility, then that's going to go up? Like, how do you know which one causes the other?
Because we've never seen it the other way around. So there's no high fertility country that's got rich, ever. And every country that is rich is low fertility. There is no country in the planet where bank deposits are, where a fertility rate, say, above 4 kids per woman. I usually talk about 3, that's the key metric. But at 4 kids, there's not a single country in the world where bank deposits are more than 40% of GDP. You need it to be, well, at least 50, ideally 100% of GDP. If you're under 40, and in fact, I mean, I've done the numbers. I've taken bank deposits for every country in the world, and I've looked at it over time. And if you've got 5 or 6 kids, your bank deposits are 20% of GDP. Now, the government debt in these countries is usually about 40% of GDP, 50. So they're basically borrowing everything the banks have got. And that means there's nothing left over for the private sector. There's nothing left over to create jobs. There's nothing left over, in fact, to fund infrastructure, electricity, roads, ports, everything we need to industrialize and take off. So it's always been fertility rates fall first. And there is one annoying exception, which is the United States. But what was interesting about the United States is they had this constant wave of highly educated immigrants, relatively highly educated. They were relatively well-educated Europeans floating into America, and then helping that country develop, despite it actually having a fairly high fertility rate. But it also had unlimited natural resources. It had an awful lot of advantages, America. If we take out that little exception, rather important exception, it's always been the other way around. You've got to get the fertility rate down first. And we've seen it just happen again and again, decade after decade in Asia. Who took off first in Asia? Japan. Fertility rate was down, followed by Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. In the 1970s and 80s, fertility rates dropped below 3. But why not? Why not the Philippines? Why not Indonesia? Why not India? Because they hadn't got the fertility rates down yet.
I guess that's why it's so interesting, is because everyone thinks you develop first and then the fertility rate comes down. But your work highlights that actually it's a prerequisite. The fertility rates have to come down and then you can develop. But so we were talking about your ideas earlier, and we were saying, well, why is it controversial? Well, it's not you've backed it by data, and you're not plucking this out of thin air, are you? But it still causes such a kerfuffle when you tell people about this.
The link between this falling fertility rate and development was actually written up in the 1950s by one of the very first development economists. He was talking about India. And he was spot on. He said India is not going to develop for generations because the fertility rate's too high. He was right. So in that regard, it's not that controversial. I'm adding in the interest rate part of the equation, which, to be fair, he probably didn't have the data for. Why is it controversial? Because I had a debate in Rwanda with the chief economist of the central bank there, very smart guy. And he just said, look, Charlie, what you're forgetting is you're a farmer. And a farmer sees value in the more hands on the farm he's got, the richer he is. Because the more cows he can manage, the more crops he can collect. So the more children you have, the more hands you've got, the richer you are. And that's worked for thousands of years. And what technology and industrialization has changed. And in fact, the fact that your kids live. The other day, you go back and anyway, we'll get back to that in another point. But the point is now that if you just want your kids to be uneducated, rural, illiterate farmers, then yes, And if there's unlimited land, as there was in America, of course, but less so in Africa now because of population growth, then as a farmer, you have always wanted lots of kids. But now we've gone into a world where to get a job in an office on 5 times the wage you'd get as a rural subsistence farmer, you need some education. And that requires an investment. So you have to change the mindset of families where the grandfather, at least, possibly the dad and the mum, are saying, no, have more children. This is a sign of your success and your wealth.
So what do you think a government policy would be more effective? Something like China where someone implements a 3-child policy? Or do you think, because, we're told that, families in poor countries have bigger families because, children die, so they have more children. And obviously they don't have the money, so they send the kids to work. So would a government need to focus more on, preventing child's death, or should, policy of saying 3 children max, what approach should they take?
Well, not the Chinese one. It was brutal and inhumane, aside from anything else. And most sad of all was that it was brutal and inhumane and unnecessary. They had this 6 kids per woman in 1970. By 1979, they were at 3 kids per woman already. The reason they'd gone up to 6 is because of the Cultural Revolution and the famine that struck China. And what happens when kids die is that you have more kids. So that, for a little while, that had boosted up the population numbers. And the Chinese were terrified, rightly, that if they carried on at 6 kids per woman, they were going to be in poverty forever, which is what's happened to Niger, by the way, since 1960. That's exactly. They are still in poverty 70 years later. So the Chinese were right to worry about it. But they didn't recognize that once people didn't fear starvation in the 70s, already their numbers had dropped below 3. So the 1-child policy then came in and brought it down below 2. And now actually around 1, they're below the replacement rate. It is going to cause them problems. Not yet. Not significant problems yet, but it will cause some problems. But you just don't need to do it. What you do need to do is what Indonesia's did and to some extent what we saw in Ethiopia and Kenya, which is just advisory campaigns. Thailand did it as well, 1980s. 2 kids good. I mean, I'd argue 2 to 3 kids is actually
the sweet spot.
The sweet spot. Because the problem is that once people start having less kids, you can go down, it's proving very difficult to reverse that decline.
Yeah.
Africa's in an amazingly good position right now, which is they can see what's gone wrong elsewhere, and that getting the fertility rate back up again is incredibly difficult. So Kenya's about to go below the 3 kids thing in 2029. And 5 years ago, I'd have been saying to the Kenyans, you've got to try and encourage families to have 2 to 3 kids, and no more on average. Everybody individually can do what they like, but on average, because then you'll take off and your economy will. But they've already got to be thinking ahead now and saying, well, actually, we're going to drop below that number in 2029. We don't want to go to 2 kids by 2050 and then 1.5 kids by 2070. We should already be changing the narrative, but only in Kenya, not in Nigeria or not in Uganda, not in Tanzania. So it's different messages for different countries, and that is a little bit complicated for people to grasp.
Of course. And you were talking about the controversial aspect, and I think now we're starting to touch on it a little, talking about these developed countries now that, like Japan, and, we're hearing a lot of population collapse and this of that nature. And there seems to be a growing anti-human narrative, especially in our generation with climate change and this and that humans are a net negative for, the world, and we need to reduce the population. So when we hear such theory, at first it seems like it can come off as like very anti-human, no more humans, we don't want population growth. But no, it seems to be just, look, we need to have a certain stability to be able to have growth. But at what point, do you look at countries like Japan or European countries and say, hey, how do we reverse population collapse? At what point do we, promote population growth and grow fertility rates?
So I would say most of Asia. So of all the countries in Asia, there's 2 that haven't yet got their fertility rate below 3. And I do ask audiences, and they don't tend to get it, but it's Afghanistan and Pakistan. And those two are the poorest countries in Asia. I mean, it's an inevitable consequence of the high fertility they've had and the illiteracy. They've only just gone above 40% adult literacy in Afghanistan, and they're still at 60% in Pakistan. You want to be at 70 or 80 to take off. So there's those two problems. But the rest of Asia should already be thinking about this. I'm worried about, I was in Thailand a few months ago now. First time I went to Thailand, the average age was about 21, and I was about 21. Great, fantastic party town.
I can imagine.
This time, I was over 50, and Thailand was over 40. Thailand's now older than the UK.
Wow.
But with a per capita GDP of about $8,000. And the UK is 40, 50, huge, massive numbers. Thailand has literally got old before it's got rich, which people keep on worrying about China. I mean, I'm generally arguing that I wouldn't worry too much for the Japanese. They've got so much cash. I know they've got debt as well, but they've got so much money. They can afford the robots and they can afford this and that to help them out. And they've got a very nice standard of life and they live forever and, well, a long time. It's, I'm less bothered by what strikes them. And to be honest, I'm not even telling people, I'm not trying to tell people what to do. If the Tanzanians or people in Congo want to carry on having 5 kids, 6 kids, that's cool. You do whatever you want. You will be in poverty. Your children will be in poverty. Your grandchildren will be in poverty. That will happen. I mean, that's the consequence of it. But you will also be a very big country, population-wise.
Generally, are they very hostile to your ideas when you go around Africa and tell them about the importance of fertility? What sort of...
who do I see? I see private sector people, mostly middle-class people, well-educated people in capital cities all over the continent. Now, that is a very different demographic to some. I mean, I talk about this on Twitter as well, but X and a bit. And that's, there's been some pushback, but it's not, it's generally a bit of abuse. And then someone kind of doesn't engage any further with the debate. So I find that interest in this idea is very high, and it resonates with everyone. The number of people I've spoken to in Nigeria, for example, where, I'm all right because I've got 2 to 3 kids and I'm in Lagos, but my cousin, my brother, he's some other state and he's got 6 or 7 kids. He keeps on asking me for money and he keeps on asking for help. And, the number of times I've heard these stories, it resonates. So private sector people I'm seeing are getting it. But what I'm trying to explain to them then is you can direct your company's growth to the markets where the fertility rates are going to be coming down. You can identify which countries are going to industrialize and when, and be ready for that.
Wow.
And that's what makes this, I think, very helpful from kind of a business and an economics point of view, not just as a social or political issue.
Because it's interesting. I saw your TEDx talk. And it's great.
TED Global, big difference.
Yeah. But you had, it's a very optimistic view. And even, your, just a very optimistic view on Africa, promoting, saying, hey, look, we need to invest. The time of Africa is coming. And it's really good for us because we speak to certain academics, talking about, doing what we have connections in Africa, the future, talking about maybe doing business in Africa. We're shut off directly. They're saying, no, corruption, it's too much hassle. Don't invest in Africa. Don't do things in Africa. And you kind of have still this optimistic view. And it's interesting to us because you come from a business banking background. So could you tell us where your optimism comes from? Do you still have the optimism? What are you seeing?
2012. So I did a first book called The Fastest Billion and did the TED Talk on the back of that. And that was very much the peak of a cyclical boom. And it was a cyclical boom that was lifting not just Africa, by the way, it was lifting all emerging markets. 2012, it was like China takes over the world. Everyone wants to be Russia's economic model. 10 years later, Chinese property crash, crumbling, slow down the economy, aging population, and Russia just at war with everybody. It's not, the whole mood music on emerging markets has changed, and that includes Africa too. So when people love emerging, they love Africa. So the first book was written at the top of that mood music swing. And I'd done a book, The Fastest Billion, which talked about education, which was such a big deal and was so right that I made that the first chapter of the second book, The Time Traveling Economist. But on other things, I was a little bit too swept up in the mood. But I guess which one?
Like what?
Just, it was agriculture, the scope for agriculture to increase yields if they just copied the Brazilian kind of miracle of the 1980s and onwards. But that hasn't really happened in the last 10 years. The fact that there was signs of manufacturing beginning to pick up across the continent. And I hadn't done the work on demographics. I hadn't done the work on interest rates. And I hadn't actually done the work then, which I then spent the next 10 years saying, okay, scratching my head. It hasn't worked out quite as well as I'd hoped. And why not? And, Time Traveling Economist and everything we're talking about is the why not. But we are seeing success. So Morocco right now, you've got more cars rolling off the assembly lines per person than in France. And these are French companies. Peugeot and Renault have gone to Morocco and said, actually, this is a better place for us to be selling and producing cars than France itself. It's working. Mauritius has been a tremendous success already. And you see companies that manage to make a success in this environment. Because the problem with the consequence of having a savings shortage, a lack of capital, is that if you've got capital, it's incredibly valuable. And this is what Marx was complaining about in the 19th century. Rich, evil capitalists have got money. It's so easy for them to make money. It's not easy. If you're Dangote in Nigeria, it's not been easy for him to make money. He's had to work incredibly hard. And that's true of all of the entrepreneurs I've met in Africa. But you've got very well-educated people, super driven, determined to make a difference, can see so many problems in their economy, which their business idea can solve one at a time. And they make money. The return on equity of some of the banks is like 30%. I think so much higher than you'd get in the West. Now, they have to navigate a lot more volatility, but you've got to kind of wonder whether some of these people are actually the best bankers in the world, because they can actually make this work.
So can you explain what you do? You work in banking.
I do lots of things at the moment, but yes, I'm advising one of the biggest banks in East Africa, Equity Group. I've been working with a fund manager. I still give them about a day a week, and I give some help via another little investment bank side. So I'm doing lots of advice and support.
So you advise, and your advice helps them direct where they invest and things of that nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, and who they lend to and who they don't lend to, and which bonds you buy and which equities you might buy and which currencies you might buy or sell.
Has your work in the Time Traveling Economist led to success in your advising and led to success in investment?
Where I think it's useful is you get rid of the dreams. You get rid of I'm not going to name names, but I see it all the time, countries saying, we're going to grow at 7 or 8% a year for the next 20. No, you're not. Can't do it. And the reason you can't do it, again, it comes back to the fertility issues, is when your average age is 18, what is that telling you about your country? It's telling you 50% of the population are children. Are they working? Are they earning money? Are they paying taxes? No, 50% are not. In fact, probably 10 or 20% of the remaining population, the adults, are having to look after the 50% of the population that are kids. So you're left with 30, 40% of adults who could actually be out there working. Now, you go to Asia right now, they've got this demographic dividend. That's when you've stopped having kids. You've got everyone's age 20 to 60. You've got 6 or 7 out of 10 people. You've got 6 or 7 working age adults. In Ghana, it's 5. So whose economy is going to grow faster? It's going to be the countries where you've got 6 or 7, not just 6 or 7 adults out of 10 versus 5, but 6 or 7 adults out of 10 with savings, because they can go to the bank and say, please lend me money at 5%, 8%. Well, in Nigeria or Ghana, you're sitting there saying, please lend me money at 25%. In fact, don't lend me money. I'll be bankrupt if I borrow at 25%.
Yeah.
And that holds back the whole story. So what it means is you can look at what's plausible growth. You need to make a business plan when you're setting up somewhere. Don't start saying we're the next Vietnam
Hmm.
when we're not.
Yeah.
You need to know where we're at and what is a realistic growth forecast, and then what is realistic for the currency. Because every foreign investor, and in fact, many, many, many local investors are saying, well, I could invest in my country or I could just invest in dollars. And you know what? Most of the time, I'm better off in dollars.
Yeah.
That's what they feel. That's not true all the time. Some years, you just want to be in the local currency and you make stellar returns.
Yeah.
So that's what I held with.
Because it's good that you've added much needed nuance, because most conversations you hear about Africa is, oh, they have this rising population, so they're going to be successful. And I think that's what you hear most of the time. And you read on like renowned art, what do you call it? Like the pages like the Economist or Financial Times, you'll just see the headline, Africa is going to be the next China because of its rising population. But you've added that much needed nuance to the conversation. And I also wanted to ask about the savings, because the way we've been taught, you know, how savings leads to investment, we've actually been taught against that, and that's not necessarily true. Like, since I don't think there's a better person to ask. What do you think about that? That investment actually comes before savings?
Yeah, I mean, where I struggle with things like this is, I remember talking to an IMF guy he said, you can't trust any of the investment figures we have on the continent. We've got no idea what the private sector's doing. None. We know what the government's doing because we can see it in their budget, so we can estimate that. But the rest of it, very, very unclear. In fact, we know, and I think it comes back to, what do you do? What do your friends do? What do people you know or businesses you come across in Africa do? And they don't go out and borrow at 25% interest rates. This is just not what, they just don't. So you're not going to get investment. And these kind of investment to GDP figures that are effectively made up when it comes to the private sector are not giving me a decent guide on what's going to happen. What does give me a good guide is what interest rates are. And to be fair, 20 years ago, they weren't set by the market, so they could be quite distorted. In fact, even under Emefiele, a few years ago in Nigeria, they're pretty distorted. Interest rates were not. He managed to manipulate local rates down, but it was a very misleading picture. You know, you need to know that. You can't just look at the data, but we do know that. So I find the interest rate story very helpful. And I think it's not just an interest rate story, just to add a little extra nuance here. Fundamentally, it's a shortage of savings issue. So if you're in the Francophone countries with the CFA peg, they have the glorious advantage, and this annoys a few people when I say this, of a stable currency and very low interest rates because it's pegged. And you can get maybe high single-digit interest rates when you're borrowing, because it's all linked to the euro. It should be 2%, but it's a bit higher But the point is, you can borrow at 7 or 8 or 9%, but your savings in your banking system is still just 20% of GDP. Now, in Nigeria, it's 20% of GDP. Interest rates are 25%. There's no lending going on. So the Francophone countries are in a better position. But just having lower interest rates isn't the only solution. You need to have low interest rates with a plentiful supply of capital. That they haven't got. They haven't got it because their fertility rate's 4, 5, or 6. In Niger's case, it's been up to 7 kids per woman. So it's anyway. Point is, we know. I understand what theorists may say.
It's not quite true.
But when you've got this shortage of capital, investment doesn't happen like that. If you go back to the 19th century in the UK, we had the slowest industrial revolution the world has ever seen. We grew at about 1 and 1.5% per capita. Asia at the moment is growing at 3, 4, 5% per capita, and they've been doing so for decades. So what they do in 2, 3 years, it was taking the UK 20 years to achieve. It's just 10 years. But we also didn't have a huge amount of savings in the UK economy. And there wasn't enough. Because there wasn't enough savings, there wasn't enough jobs. Because there wasn't enough jobs, British people went to Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, or America, Canada, Argentina, anywhere to try and find jobs, because there wasn't enough jobs here. And the companies that made money, Boots and Sainsbury's, they did it from their own reinvested profits. They weren't trying to borrow the small pool of savings in the banks, or at least not often. So it's a problem. This isn't a new story. This is a story we've seen in Europe in the 19th century. And of course, what we see in the 21st century Africa is Africans moving abroad for jobs. Nigerians going to Canada, or Ugandans moving to Dubai. Very interesting how it just does exactly the same thing. So anyway, sorry. So I don't know if I've exactly answered your question, but I think the savings pool drives the investment story.
Okay. I also wanted to ask you about sort of this reconfiguration of the global financial system somewhat. This move away from the dollar, central banks are adopting more gold. How do you think this impacts Africa specifically? What do you predict? What do you foresee there?
We've just seen the Ghanaian cedi appreciate about 30% in a month, 6 weeks. It's the most incredible rise of a currency because they export gold and they're making so much money out of it. They've gone into current account surplus. They're exporting more than they're importing. Tanzania is doing well out of this. Even Uganda, which re-exports gold, is doing well out of this. So a few countries are like really obvious, straightforward beneficiaries just of that move. In terms of the dollar story or euro, or
do you think it's overstated?
I just don't think it matters that much. It's not that big a deal.
But why? Because I've been taught that this is very significant, and these countries incur costs from holding the dollars and euros, and if this dynamic were to change, they would benefit a lot from it.
I don't. Do
you think that's drivel?
Yeah, I do. I do. Unfortunately, I don't see that the dollar's strength, or the dollar's widespread use, or the British pound's widespread use before the dollar determined when countries, or whether countries took off. The British pound was the dominant global currency. It's clearly the one thing we would have definitely wanted was Germany not to take off. Bloody hell, it did. 1980, and 19th century Germany did incredibly well. And the Americans would surely have loved Japan not to have done great in the 1930s and 40s as the dollar was, but they did. Their economy took off as well. So it's never managed to prevent other countries from succeeding. And
it didn't stop Korea, did it? Or
hasn't stopped anyone in Asia. So they've all done well with this existing system. I think people want, and we had this back in dependency theory. I don't know if you come across dependency theory yet. So this whole setup from the Latin Americans in the 1960s, where did that come from? It came from a continent that was high fertility. High fertility, and therefore couldn't take off, and therefore couldn't industrialize, therefore couldn't wean itself off its commodity dependency, and therefore you found some academics who found a load of reasons to justify why it wasn't anything to do with Latin America. This was all America's fault. And it's not. Interestingly, in the 70s and the 80s then, as Latin America went into default, because countries that are high fertility don't have savings, they end up borrowing too much, they default. Europe did it for hundreds of years. Latin America did it for 200 years, until they went low fertility. And Chile was one of the first, and didn't struggle in the same way that others did in the 1980s Latin American debt crisis. And now everybody's followed. You still get a few incompetent governments who manage to default even when they're low fertility and they've got plenty of savings, or they should. I mean, there's still like 4 or 5 countries that can blow themselves in the foot.
Why? Because of politics? Or
weirdly, because of politics. And
it's like politics,
and you've got to get
usual.
Deep down into the social. Why does Argentina default every 5, 10, 20 years? I mean, it's done it for centuries. Why? And I've heard all sorts of funny theories, but I mean, you can't, there's a few countries that it's just a bit tough to explain. But in the vast majority, so I don't think it matters about gold, dollar, euro, China. That's never held back any other country, and it's not what's holding people back now.
So what's holding people back is education, electricity, and fertility.
Yeah, and the electricity is a derivative, really, of the fertility argument.
In what way?
Because electricity prices, I know you're looking at renewables, right, versus in your, So all electricity prices, whether it's wind, coal, nuclear, or anything else, the cost of that electricity is determined by the interest rate at which you're funding your project. And it doesn't matter what country you're in, America, China, India, doesn't matter, UK. So if you use an interest rate assumption of 10% to price the value of the money you're borrowing to invest versus an interest rate of 3%, that will drive up the price of electricity by 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%. So you cannot be an economically competitive economy if your electricity prices are 20, 30, 40, 50% higher than other people because your interest rates are higher.
But does the type of electricity a country makes, can they get different interest rates, or the interest rates are
Interest rates are kind of set at the country level by the level of savings, and I argue by the level of fertility in that country.
And then, so you mentioned that, you had South America that they dropped fertility, and then they had this growth. What led to their drop in fertility? Like, how can, if the drop in fertility is really going to help countries, what leads to the drop in fertility?
Education.
Education.
And then there are countries that actively encourage it, like Thailand and Indonesia and so on. And there are other countries where, for whatever reason, people keep on saying, is religion a factor in here? Maybe the Catholic thing slowed down that have less killed children kind of debate. Maybe there's a guy called Max Weber, I think it was, who said this a Protestant work ethic that made Northern Europe succeed. I wonder whether it was Protestants just had a few less kids on average than the Catholics in the Southern Europe, and as a result they took off a bit faster.
Well, that's the thing as well, is like education.
I mean, education as well.
But then you could argue that lower fertility will get higher education.
How?
If people have less kids, they can afford a better education. If you have just one or two kids, then you put everything into them.
That's
so
what
then
happens.
it becomes a causation issue. What comes first, right? The chicken or the egg?
Well, we know that still because ignorant populations that can't read and write have high fertility rates. And we know that once you raise we're still getting fertility rates across most of Africa where we're still at 4 or 5 kids. And this is in places like Tanzania, which has actually got adult literacy of about 80%, 75, 80.
Tanzania.
Yes, they did it.
Tanzania is doing good.
Their kind of socialist mindset in the 60s did a really good job of getting some of the basics right. And the basics of socialism was always education, some degree of healthcare, i.e. lower child mortality rates, better maternal mortality rates. So they got stuff right. They have a surprisingly high fertility rate, given the level of education. And they have a very low per capita GDP, $1,000. Now, that's not a surprise, because they got the high fertility rate. They haven't got the savings. So we can see again and again and again, you can have the education, but until you get the fertility rate down, you don't get the wealth. You don't tend to see fertility rates. Well, I haven't seen it in any of the data, I think, collapse in uneducated populations.
But when you say education, that's quite a broad term.
Yeah, go on.
So could you specify what you mean? Is it just so people are literate or secondary education? What is the...
Literate is enough. And by literate, it's saying farming is hard work in Hausa, in Wolof, in Indian, English, Hindu, whatever. Any language. Farming is hard work. Can you write that? If you can, then you can stop doing the hard work that's farming, subsistence farming. You can go and get a job in a textile mill, because you'll know when the jeans roll off the conveyor belt whether to put it into the box for America or the box for Europe. And what's amazing about this is that Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, he's the grandfather, he's the all economics, doesn't mention literacy once in his book.
At all.
Because Scotland had 100% adult literacy in 1750. Because of religion.
Because of their...
They Presbyterian, they were like, everyone has to go and read the Bible, and that's what you have to do.
Paid off?
It did pay it well. It paid off. The only trouble Scotland had was that they still had high fertility and they didn't have cheap energy. So they all left, including some ancestor of mine, left Scotland 100 years ago, traipsed down to ignorant England and started working in the coal mines where there was quite cheap, plentiful energy. And hence the Industrial Revolution took off.
But I guess it goes amiss because people just look at the physical aspects. I mean, in Bangladesh, they just say the reason why their textile sector has been so successful is because their women have very
Dexterous fingers.
Yeah, nimble hands, and no one considers the being literate is also important for
No, it's exactly right. And Adam Smith said exactly that.
Exactly. So I guess
Dexterous fingers is what you need for textiles, just completely ignoring the fact that you needed to be actually able to read and write. And Danny Roderick wrote the same thing. He's a current kind of economist, very well regarded. And he's a great guy, does fantastic work. But I've seen him write, it's all about the dexterous fingers. It's not. It's about the literacy. And they've had a problem with Ethiopia here, because you've only got about 50% adult literacy in Ethiopia. And about August time, the harvest, I say August because I'm a Northern Hemisphere guy. I don't know when the harvest is in Ethiopia. But anyway, at harvest time, people leave the factories to go back and harvest their food. Oh. And the textile mill owners are saying, no, this is like we've got a 24-hour run production run. You can't leave. You can't leave. So I think that's related to, anyway, with education, I think that changes. Now they've now got education qualifications for to employ people in these textile mills in Ethiopia. So I suspect that changes. But Bangladesh, low fertility country for decades actually, and then they hit the literacy rate of 70% you need to be able to work in textiles. They did that about 15 years ago. Yeah, and textile Takeoff. We all have Bangladeshi clothes on us now.
Yep.
What do you make of the recent Economics Nobel Prize? They kind of built their work on arguing that, good governance will lead to development.
My book is like the counter argument to that. So they've won a Nobel Prize, and in time, they've sold 9 million books, and I've sold but at least one to one of you guys. I've got big ambitions for I am the counter to that. This is a structural issue, and we can count it. And the Why Nations Fail thesis, it's a really interesting book, and it is a good read. But I disagree. You can't count it very well. And where you can count it, it's not clear to me.
What do you mean
the data.
Count what?
We can count it. I mean, I am showing you interest rates, and I am showing you demographic figures, and I'm showing you electricity figures, and I'm showing you interest rates. And I'm doing all of that in the book, and you can see the progression. Why Nations Fail? They say corruption's too bad. Well, how much corruption's too bad?
Right. How do you measure good governance?
So the example I keep on talking about is Korea. Second best, maybe third best development model we've ever seen. China, arguably, is in the top 3. Singapore, I'd probably put as number 1.
So you put Korea over China?
They did it without the coercion of the single child policy. So
more lessons to be learned.
I think they did extreme, and they did so much so cleverly. It was about education first in the 1950s. They got adult literacy up to nearly 100% by 1960 from 35. Japanese had left them with nothing. Not nothing, but 35% was too low. Then they get up to 100, and then they start to plan already in the 70s. Okay, we're going to do textiles now, but we need to be doing heavy industry in 20 years' time. So we need our graduates now to start going to university to do the hard STEM subjects that'll give us the Samsungs and LGs and Daewoo's of the 1990s. They were thinking this already in the 70s. And when it came to electricity, and this is very relevant for Africa today, by the way, they said, no, rural villages can't have electricity. We've got no interest in you guys having electricity unless you pay for it yourself. We're not subsidizing you. We can't afford that. We're going to make TVs, and locals can only buy Korean black and white televisions. If you want a color one, no, you can't buy them. They're for America. That's how we're going to make our money. It was very like, who can we sell to who's got cash? And the whole model has been very, very successful. I completely lost my train of thought. So we were in China and Korea and Singapore being the top 3
development models.
Yeah, but I managed to. Where did I get?
We were talking about just how your book is a counter argument.
Oh, right.
And that you can count things.
So when I was writing my book, we had 4 Korean presidents in jail for corruption.
Wow,
that's pretty impressive. Like pretty well every president for the last 20 years has ended up in. This is the tail end of an incredibly successful economic model. When you hit $30,000-$40,000 per capita GDP, corruption falls. At least on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions
Can you say that
Index.
again?
When you're sub $10,000 per capita GDP, which almost everyone in Africa is, big chunk of Asia still is, corruption levels are high. And people don't make a huge fuss about it because your problem as a typical person in any country is getting food onto the table for your kids, your family. You haven't got time for the fact that the president's stealing money. That's not your problem. In fact, you don't pay income tax. There's only a few million income taxpayers in Pakistan, 200 million population plus. Same in Nigeria. It's only a few million direct income taxpayers. So you probably don't pay income tax. And somebody's stealing money from, I don't know, the oil fields, but you don't see that money anyway. It's just like, this isn't your big issue. $30,000 per capita GDP. You've now industrialized. Everyone's got a formal official job. Everyone's paying taxes. Now you're really upset when the president steals money. And that's why the Koreans have got 4 presidents in jail. Because now they're upset. In the 1970s, they weren't upset. And they were, corruption was corruption and so be it. So their argument is that it's all about institutions. And it's like, well, okay, the institutions are, corruption's great and you get a fantastic development model is what Korea's kind of hinting at. India's growing at an incredible rate and has been doing for 10 to 20 years. Philippines, Indonesia. I can promise you corruption is a very significant problem in each of those countries. It's not holding them back. Why? They've got education. They've got low fertility now. They've got electricity. They can industrialize. You get the functional stuff right. Corruption will get addressed. It does get addressed because we do care about it. Once we've satisfied our essential needs, we start to get very upset when people are basically taking money out of our pocket.
So how did you feel when you saw they won the Nobel Prize?
Deeply jealous.
No, because I mean, you've been working on this, you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at this, and then these guys that are, talking about some theoretical stuff get a Nobel Prize saying, yeah, this is great, which goes completely against what you think is true.
Do you think part of it is also because of your background? You're not an academic per se, but your work is very valuable, very insightful. And I think because of your background, you've made your arguments more tangible. It's backed more. It's more foolproof, if that makes sense. Whereas Acemoglu and Robinson, it's extremely theoretical, very ambiguous. I mean, what even is good governance? What even is an inclusive institution?
Exactly.
I could have a definition and it could be completely different to yours.
That's what I mean about numbers and being able to count it.
And I think that is your advantage. But I guess because you're outside of the field of academia, perhaps that lets you down. What do you think about that?
That may be. There's also an awful lot of rigor, which I think academics have the time to put in, to double check and to triple check. I do find it. I find it. There's something about the real world experience which just changes how you look at the numbers. I remember reading somebody who was dismissing the idea of democratization always happening as you rise up in income levels. And when I look at the data, I've been doing emerging markets, I've covered so many countries. There's a clear chunk of countries where it doesn't apply. If you export oil, you don't democratize. You have to export quite a lot of oil per person. But if you do, you never democratize because you never have to give your people a vote because your people are never paying any taxes. So you really, why do I care how the economy's doing when I'm getting paid 50,000, 100,000 by the Gulf government that I live under and they'll educate my kids in America for free. I mean, I've got no great complaint about society in that story. So these countries never democratize. So I did a kind of study that shows what are the odds of democratization at any income level. And at very low income levels, it's not great. It's not the big priority. Democracy, coup, autocracy, generals, we don't really, whatever. But as we go up the income curve, we do care. And it's pretty clear, very clear in the data. I think there's only one, Singapore was the only kind of exception. City-states are always a little bit different. But I've seen one, I think it may have been Robinson or Acemoglu, kind of dismissing this and saying, no, because if you do all countries, then you don't see that link. And of course you don't if you've got to exclude the oil exporters. You've got to understand why you're excluding them. But no, it's fine. As long as people get the message, and if anything, I'd have a problem more with the publishers that I wanted this book to be sold with a single-digit price. so that it gets stocked in bookshops. It can't get stocked in bookshops
How
at
much is
20,
it?
£25 it launched at. That's just that.
It's dear.
It's over the edge of what most people will buy.
So you didn't have control over the pricing.
I did. They wanted to sell it at 75.
75.
It's a kind of academic book, and it's going to sell. We'll just sell it to 50 universities, and that'll kind of cover its costs, well, their cost, not mine. But I said, no, please, I'm not. I don't care how little my money is off this. It's really only 7%. I get 7% of each sale. So that's not about. You don't publish a book to make money. I just wanted it to be more. But I know I'm talking to them now, and they're suggesting that I could do a free ebook version of a second edition, updating some new UN numbers that actually changed the story a bit for a few countries.
When did you know you were going to write this? When was that light bulb moment?
It had been on my mind. No, it was at COVID. Gave me a bit of space. I used to be on a plane every 3 weeks and didn't have time to do it, and COVID gave me time.
Okay, fair.
And so you're on plane every 3 weeks? Oh,
I was. I've cut that since COVID and since the tech revolution, kind of this recognition we can use the internet, which, by the way, could change a big conclusion of the book. And this is why I need to do a second edition, because what we discovered through COVID was that we can do online stuff and we can perhaps sell services online where previously you needed a port and roads and a huge electricity infrastructure and a textile mill. Now I just need a solar panel on my roof and a broadband cable. The capital cost of that is so much less, which means the amount of money I need in the banking system, I could take off perhaps and get high income with much less savings in the banking system. In which case, maybe higher fertility countries like Tanzania today or Uganda today could start to show massive service growth sales at a high fertility rate. And that would be very exciting.
And thoughts on robots and AI replacing, we're talking about dexterous fingers. Now you have robots that are starting to have dexterous fingers.
The whole first chapter on literacy comes from me going into the LSE library, London School of Economics library in 2015, 16, worrying about robots taking our jobs. I had a conversation with a smart Kenyan civil servant. He said, 3D printing is going to kill manufacturing. So, oh God, yeah, you might have a point. And then I went and I thought, well, hold on, technology's always been doing this. So I was trying to look at Korea in the 1950s and 60s, and why was technology kind of not killing jobs then? We've always worried about it. And one of those books on that bookshelf about Korea in the 50s ended up taking me to a book on literacy. And hence this book. So basic line of all economists will tell you this. We're more technologically advanced than we've ever been. Nearly everyone's got a job. So in low fertility countries with plentiful savings. So there's a huge question mark about AI. So far, every technological advance has created jobs that we could never imagine. Like people doing podcasts.
Yeah. Who would have thought? But so, like, for example, what's the you talk to these investors and banks, or what's the mood around AI investment? Are they still just investing in electricity or infrastructure? Like where are the investings at Africa? Where do you work? You work Africa? You work
it comes up. I mean, I was at a I was at a private equity conference yesterday, and you got I can't remember how many companies. They employ 70,000 people across the continent, $3 billion worth of sales. And the whole afternoon session was based on AI. What does AI mean for Africa? What does it mean for our businesses? What can we do for it? And it was quite interesting. There were the stories about farmers finding it useful. I was trying to do two things at once.
I think I've seen that video of drones and the best places to have crops and things like that. The most fertile areas or something. They're doing that in Nigeria, which is quite interesting. But yeah.
There's the gains that could be had from a bit of good capital investment anywhere on the continent, almost anywhere, are incredibly high. So I can fully believe that. I mean, my starting point a year ago when I wrote a column for FDI Markets on this was actually the Gulf countries might be in a better spot because they got huge amounts of capital and huge amounts of cheap energy, which at the time in 2024 we thought was essential. With DeepSeek and the Chinese, maybe we don't need quite so much energy. We'll see. But Africa's got a lack of capital and a lack of electricity. Unlikely to be the most obvious beneficiary of AI. In terms of, well, I don't know. In terms of using it, though, maybe I don't know.
Yeah,
it's beyond my.
Okay, what about Bitcoin? Because my mate's an analyst, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you there's pro-Bitcoin people who constantly say this is it for Africa. They can improve their financial situation by adopting Bitcoin, and if you have a repressive,
there's still an electricity cost to it, right?
But interestingly enough, people say that because Africa has loads of untapped energy potential, so Bitcoin miners will go to a river, let's say in Kenya, and they will set up like a mini hydro dam, and this can sort of kickstart the sort of powering Africa, because I guess it's hard. Like how does a government, or how does one start a grid or start the process of powering the country? It's very costly. Who's going to pay for it? And Bitcoin mining sort of answers that, because these companies will go and start a hydro dam, and they will be remunerated for producing Bitcoin. And this can sort of kickstart the process, and then others can come into that and tap into that power. This is what they say, but
I haven't seen any data on it. But what you get from what you get from the economies that we've got, it is people trying to find solutions to problems, and that sounds like a potential solution to a problem, and anything that works. And solar panels and being able to sell your service to America as an accountant, that could be another solution. We've now got the most. I was looking at the literacy numbers for the continent in 1960, and I think it was something like 25 million literate adults who could read or write any 4 words in any language in 1960, and now it's like 650 million. And so you've got just so many more people potentially coming up with good ideas about how to make money, how to find a solution. Particularly young people who are now connected to the rest of the world, and hopefully one of these, all of these ideas come through and help out.
But Bitcoin specifically, do you think that will help, or you're not?
In that anyone can do it from anywhere. Maybe it does. I always, I look at it as an economist. I look at it as a sense of, is there a value in a non-fiat currency, or something not controlled by governments? And gold has always represented that. But gold wasn't always an option for everybody. You couldn't necessarily make money off gold unless you're literally mining it. With Bitcoin, you do have that potential to actually make it. So, yeah, maybe. I not my expertise.
Okay, fair.
How did you get into this line of work, and how did you get into this interest of Africa and Asia, but mostly it seems Africa? Like, how did you get interested?
There's probably always some family story elements to it, but I think I'd had an interest in Eastern Europe for a very long time as a kid, and then the Berlin Wall had fallen down, and that interest became, you're seeing one of the biggest economic experiments of all time, which is communist economies becoming capitalist. And it was catastrophic. I mean, the GDP declines 20, 30, 40%. It was the Great Depression of America in a year.
Wow.
And it was inflation. I remember looking at a chart once, and it was asking people, how many countries do you think had an inflation rate above 1,000% in 1994? It was like 20 countries. And most of them were Eastern Europe. Wow. Had inflation rates of 1,000% or more. I mean, just insane economic chaos. Absolute fascinating story. But after 20 years of covering those countries, or 15 years, they all became really quite dull by comparison. Now they all have interest rates of like 1 or 2% and inflation rates of like 2 or 3%. And it's and they're all lovely cities, and it's all been wonderful, and they've reintegrated. And I argue now that a big chunk of that is because their education levels in 1900 were up there with Western Europe, ahead of Greece, ahead of Portugal. And we're now seeing some of those countries like Czech Republic ahead of Greece and ahead of Portugal in per capita GDP. They've kind of caught up again after 40, 50 years of communism. But as they became dull, it was like you look around the world in 2010 and say, okay, so where's the interesting continent? Obviously, Asia is going to just boom. I mean, it was kind of obvious to everyone anyway, but it's even more obvious from my book. It's just going to carry on for decades. There's Latin America, which you need to speak Spanish for. And then there's a continent with the best music on the planet. And it's within a flight distance, and everyone in London knows people from the continent. It's just, there's a mix, so there's a communication. It's just, so it becomes a very, very easy, well, for me, it just became the next most fascinating story. And it's beaten all my expectations, actually.
Okay.
I didn't expect it to be as cool as it is.
You said it's the best music in the world.
That's my playlists are just.
Give us some recommendations.
No. It's embarrassing. I've got.
Why?
Oh, because it's the sort of thing. I'd have to look at my Spotify playlists now. So this year, I suddenly got into South African stuff. Masaki or something. I'm not very good on names. Anyway, you're going to edit this, right?
Yeah, well, no, we kind of keep it rolling, but
man, there's so much good stuff. So it's some Master KG. I don't know who he is, but he's some producer in South Africa, and he's all the songs sound roughly. I mean, they do sound quite similar, but I think they're all brilliant. And he's been. I think everyone he's playing with is fantastic. Very into Tiva Savage last year.
Are these like contemporary artists?
Tiva Savage is like Nigeria 20. She was actually on X Factor and then went back to Nigeria, and she's got quite big over there.
Okay.
Anyway, there's just a long list of my tunes, and I go to countries and I listen to the local radio. Sometimes it is back to 1970s kind of Nigerian tunes that are amazing, and then it's good fun. Yeah,
no, it's fun. Well, we're a big fan of Afro beats and high life. The older stuff, though, personally.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah.
So did your connection? I mean, we said earlier Africa's a big place, and so did your connection start with Nigeria?
That was not the first place. Where did I fly first? I think for when I joined Renaissance Capital, and it was like, right, you're on a plane to Kenya, and then you're on a plane to Nigeria, and then it's Ghana, and Anglophone dominant, very much. So those. And
so, what was your role flying into these countries?
It was to try and work out where Kenya's economy was going over the next 5 years, 5 months, where the currency was going in the next 1 month, and which companies were likely to benefit. I mean, that was. My job was more on the currency side, the interest rate side, the growth story. And then I worked with analysts who looked at the companies and said, that's the best bank in Kenya, or this is the best cement company in Africa, or whatever. And
do you still work on Kenya nowadays?
Yeah, no, with Equity Group, one of the biggest banks.
So what are your thoughts on Kenya's future? I mean, they seem to have a good leader. They seem to have, good institutions.
Isn't there a bit of civil unrest at the minute?
There was in 24 about tax rises. The problem that Kenya's, it's not just been a Kenya problem. Ghana defaulted on its debt over the similar related issues I think Zambia did too, Ethiopia has done too. And in Kenya, there was concern they were going to default in 24. The government was saying, we're not going to default, we're going to raise taxes. And then people came out in the streets and said, you already take quite a lot of tax. Can you spend the money you tax already better? I mean, that's just one of the parts of the story. I think the difficulty for governments, and this is, I wrote the book to try and explain to governments why are they paying high interest rates and what do they need to be careful of. And one of the things they need to be careful of is borrowing too much money from abroad. And what happened in the last 10 years is everybody could borrow anything they wanted at like 2 or 3%. I mean, I exaggerate slightly. It was money, but Rwanda managed to get a bond away in 2021 at 5.5%, 6% in dollars. Unbelievable. That's less than my mortgage rate now. This is Rwanda. It's a B- credit, and I'm a better credit than B-. So anyway, that's a sovereign rating. But the point being is that a lot of governments went out and borrowed because they kind of thought, if I borrow and build infrastructure, and they built a railway in Kenya, and they built a fantastic expressway around Nairobi, and then everything else will be good. But if you haven't got plentiful savings, you built a great road, but you haven't got the electricity you need to fuel a factory. In fact, you haven't got the factory. You haven't got the factory or the electricity or necessarily the really good port. So you've got the great road or you've got the great railway, but you haven't got everything else that goes with it. And you can't go out and borrow all of the money for all of those things as well, because you will literally go into default, which Ethiopia did, and Zambia did, and Ghana did. Kenya hasn't. So, but it means they're carrying quite a high debt load. So for the next few years, it's tricky.
So
It's all going to take off for them. In the 2030s, it's going to be amazing. Kenya's going to be leading industrialization in Africa.
Wow.
2020s, next 4 or 5 years, got to carry that debt. It's hard.
So do you think China's kind of involvement, which seems to be kind of going in and doing these infrastructure projects, isn't that great? Because it's not fixing the, yes, that country is going to get that one road or that one port, but it's not fixing the root problem. Do you think those loans are beneficial?
The Chinese, so first I say why nations fail. Nobel Prize winners aren't right. And now I'm going to say China's got it wrong as well. But China didn't understand its own development model. It didn't get that because it had the one-child policy. And this all came from an IMF paper, by the way, this idea. I started looking into the data then. Over half of their savings growth in China was because of the one-child policy. So anyway, so the Chinese have got huge amounts of money. So they can build roads and railways and ports everywhere. And there's enough money left over to build incredible companies producing cheap, extra cheap, even cheaper goods that everybody wants. And they can go up the value-added curve and start doing more tech stuff. And half my kids have got Chinese phones, literally Chinese, not iPhones made in China, but literally Chinese phones in their pocket. So they've done an incredible job because they had so much savings. And they said, so if we lend money to the continent, to Africa, to Pakistan, to Sri Lanka, then and build their roads and railways, they'll take off, without recognizing they needed to bring the money in for everything else as well. The good thing about them is that they lent at 3% interest rates. The bad thing about it was that money was tied to using a Chinese construction company, which made a 30% profit margin on the loan paid for by the Chinese. The Chinese lent the money, uses a Chinese construction company to build a road, mostly to get copper out to sell to China.
Yeah.
That in Zambia's case. And so China did very well out of this, really. But what they didn't do was kickstart industrialization in Africa because it wasn't enough in itself. And they've ended up, it was actually Chinese debt that no one knew about in Zambia that tipped them over the edge into default. So I think it helps because it's 3% interest rates. That is helpful. It's helpful because the roads do get built, and whoever's building them, that's great. And if you're funding it in Zambian interest rates at 25%, the road will not get built. So it is good, but it hasn't solved all the problems.
And what about the idea that these credit rating agencies, they have biases against Africa? Do you think that's just overstated? Or fundamentally, the situation is very dire, so why would you lend at favourable terms to these countries?
Yeah, I don't think there's a story here, but I know
many people do.
I think there is. The study that this came from was done in 2014 or 2013, based on data that I think only ran up to 2007 or 8 or 9. And the number of countries that had borrowed and had been properly rated even, at that point was extremely low. I think Ghana may have done one bond. I think South Africa obviously had issued a lot, and Egypt had done a lot. And anyway, they said, taking this data from 2007 and 8, it shows the rating agencies have got it wrong. And I just don't see that in the data since. I think, I've worked at a fund manager where you're looking at 80 countries a day and you're trying to say, do I like that country? Do I like this country? If the rating agencies were wrong, we'd all be owning just African debt. Because if the rating agencies weren't getting the risk right, it's free money for us.
Yeah.
And fund managers aren't stupid. They're paid to be caring about one thing, which is to get these sort of metrics right. And we do not trust the rating agencies. We look at the data and say, is there an oddity here? Because if there is, then there is free money, and that's great. Yeah, that happens. To be fair, Egypt, late 2023, if you believe they're about to get UA money or bailed out by the IMF, you wanted to buy those bonds, and you made a lot of money very, very easily. And the rating agencies don't forecast that. because they can't forecast something that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
If it was true that the rating agencies were wrong, then there'd be a hedge fund already set up to trade against that.
Okay, interesting. Because you don't often hear the other side to that. But yeah.
It's I also know people I've always found it quite useful to talk to the rating agencies people. They found it useful to talk to me, and I know people who have worked there, and I know one guy's going to write a book on it. He's planning to anyway. He's going to say he's going to go against this argument, the narrative.
So he's going to completely dispel the argument.
That's the argument, but it comes back to that same thing of you've got a lot of smart people on the continent saying, why haven't our countries taken off yet? Is it because our banks are greedy and ripping off our savers? Is it ripping off our borrowers? And is it because the credit rating agencies have got it wrong? Or is it because dependency theory, Latin America, 1960s style, it's all about the dollar? We can see in the data it's not. These aren't the issues.
Have you spoken to Dangote by any chance?
I had dinner with him once or twice. But no. But it's only once or twice. He wouldn't remember me. He's a very interesting man, very driven man. He's been incredibly successful. And what I find interesting about him is he's reinvested all of his profits.
Yeah.
Like Boots and Sainsbury's back in the 19th century. He's done that and reinvested in his own companies and then built new companies and made them profitable and reinvested those into the next project. And it's through flour, sugar, cement, and now into oil refinery. It's very impressive. And he likes Arsenal.
That's a plus. Wow.
What would you say are the top prospects in Africa? And would you put Nigeria in there?
On the time traveling economist metrics, it's all about Morocco now.
Morocco is nice. I keep telling people Morocco. You land in Morocco, you land in Rabat, you're shocked. The roads, the lights, like it's Europe.
Yeah,
it is. It's very much like Southern Europe, and the fertility rates and the education. The only problem they've got in Morocco is lack of female participation in the labour force. It's not high enough. So if you want to be as successful as Vietnam,
is it growing?
Yeah, it's been picking up. But the education levels, the women I've worked with, they're brilliant. I mean, it's not about whether or not the people are good or not. It's just whether or not they're encouraged to work. So that would help their economy grow faster, if that's what people choose to prioritize. But Morocco's going to be great it's already doing very well. It should continue to be great for
What about a country like Tunisia?
And then I can gloss over that difficult question. And then you can go to Egypt and say that should be the one next. They've now got the literacy rate they need. They've got the low fertility rate they need. As soon as the government stops borrowing quite as much money as they do each year, they really are borrowing it all. There's not enough left for the private sector. Egypt should be the next takeoff. That's where we'll be buying our clothes made in Egypt in 5-10 years' time. Anyway, Tunisia is one of those stories which has not worked out as well as it should have done. So it is one of the most successful manufacturing economies. It does have a decent manufacturing base and it sells commodities. It's got a broad range. It's got the tourism story. It's got well-educated people. In 2010, it was leading the Arab Spring because they'd hit that democratization income level of about $8,000 to $10,000 actually. And it's like, that's when people start to say, I want a vote that matters. And then they would have said, I want a lowest corruption and all the rest. And I think they've been terribly let down by their politicians. They had a technocratic, kind of technocratic, that's been kind, but nonetheless, he had delivered education, a technocratic regime for 30 or 40 years that had created industry and had created manufacturing. And when that regime got toppled, the guys who took over just hadn't got a clue what they were doing. And I say that looking at things like the budget deficit numbers. If you just borrow vastly more than you can afford over time, and your debt levels are going up, and you're throwing money at non-economic things that aren't helping your economy grow, and your unemployment's growing even as you're spending more.
Wow!
It was quite hard to believe, but they were also had the misfortune of having this revolution as Europe slumped into a kind of post-global financial crisis morass. Italy stopped growing. Who's their biggest export market? Italy. Followed by France, basically wasn't growing much either. So their second biggest market, France. So they've lost their kind of big export markets. They had irresponsible politicians, change of government every 2 or 3 years. It's should have done better.
And now is it idle? Is it, do you see it going up? How do you see?
Don't know. I was there last year, and I thought they wouldn't default. They haven't defaulted. They've got an odd president who's saying we can do everything on our own. We're going to pay back our foreign debt. We don't need this anymore. We're going to spend less on pointless imported cars.
Well, that seems to be a kind of universal trend.
Yeah, populist kind of leader who appeals to the people, and all the smarty pant middle classes don't really like him very much. But he's interesting. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
And on the flip side, what countries are you most pessimistic about? So you said Niger. What else really frightens you?
It's the whole Sahel is just. It's what I find depressing is that I haven't got a solution at all on a 10-year or even 20-year probably view, because their literacy rates are, in some cases, still sub 40%. And that's you're talking 40% of the men, can well, slightly more than that, can read and write, and none of the women. And it's just
absolutely none.
Well, no, not none, but it's like some of the northern states of Nigeria we're talking about, like 10%.
Wow.
So you get something like this. So Niger, in some of the countries, it'd be something like 50% of the men, 10% of the women. So you're averaging out at 30% adult literacy. You need 70 to 80% to take off.
Such a long way to go.
Countries, on average, manage to gain their literacy rate by a percentage point a year for adults. And that's because the young population are coming into the generation. So it takes time. Implying we're 40 years away from them getting off poverty per capita GDP.
Oh.
Unless these guys who've just taken over in some of these countries, these military leaders, recognize that educating women is the single most important thing they can do. And men, of course, but not, as well. But they've overthrown, the president of Niger was exactly one of those people who was trying to do this. He had prioritized female education, and he just got chucked out by somebody who's more interested in having fights with the French over anything than they are about educating women, from what I can see.
I mean, I was going to ask, what do you make of the coups that happen over the Sahel? Because even this this guy in Niger, people were complaining that he was placed in there by the French and that he was, giving the French companies uranium deals and that.
The contrast is between countries that have just got the double demographic dividend, Philippines, Indonesia, India. It's like life is so easy. Your savings are massive. There's so much money to create jobs. Your economy grows at 5-6% a year. And everyone attributes it to the leader and says, it's all because Modi in India is so clever. And it's like, no, he's there at the right time. Lucky man. And it's the same in Indonesia. They've had basically a regime handover in Indonesia. It wasn't because they all wanted this general. It was because he'd been kind of anointed by the previous president, because the economies are going great. It's wonderful when you've got the double demographic dividend. When you're old and fiscally feeble, like Western Europe or America, you get all grumpy and a bit
cranky,
Brexity and Trumpy and all the rest. And we're seeing that. And the other end of the spectrum is when you're too young. And when you're too young as an economy, you haven't got any savings and you cannot deliver prosperity. So all the guys have been kicked out. Niger, Burkina, Mali, none of them had produced great wealth. They couldn't. Their adult literacy is at 35%, 30%. How could they possibly? So coups tend to be quite popular. Max Solomon did some great work in Nigeria actually about this. He's done some beautiful work, beautiful books. And coups, when they happen, it's frustration with these leaders who failed you. Because you keep on thinking somehow this guy in the next 5 years is going to sort my life out. Not when your adult literacy rate is 35%, he's not. He's not going to sort your life out in the next 10 years. At best, 20, much more likely. And that requires good policy. So you're getting these guys are getting thrown out by another coup in 5 or 10 years' time, if not quicker.
And in that same way, people look at the leaders, and in that same way, people look at colonialization that say that, we're in this mess because of the colonial powers and that. So if we kick them out, we can finally regain our strength.
Originally, they had a point. Well, I don't know about they had a point, but if you go to what did the colonizers leave in terms of adult literacy as their bequest, their legacy, and it was at best about 25%.
Really?
That was the British. The French, and that's only because of the missionaries, it wasn't British government policy. And the French, 5%.
Wow, you would
Portuguese,
expect
3%.
you would expect the opposite, that they come in, they build schools, and you have high literacy. But no, that
No,
didn't
that
happen.
really didn't happen.
Wow.
No, they were already there for like 80 years. We've had nearly that long since the end of colonization. We're heading that way. So no, they were kind of almost a token presence, but nonetheless, they didn't transform the story in a positive way. And they built a couple of railroads to a mine and then left 60 years later having done not very much.
Do you think there's this ideological aspect where people are sort of very taken in, understandably, by this like decolonization movement and just anti-Western rhetoric, and perhaps we lose sense of what's really going on, because as long as your policies are very anti-Western, people associate that with being beneficial, when actually perhaps you need a more pragmatic approach, and cooperating with the West can be to your advantage. I mean, earlier you mentioned the CFA franc and saying there are some advantages of that currency, whereas most people, they see it in a very negative light. So do you think a lot gets lost with that very ideological stance towards thinking about Africa's development? Or is it difficult?
Yeah, I think you just take whatever you can from anyone, anywhere you can. So if you can sell your products to any market, fantastic, do it. If you can borrow money as cheaply as possible from anywhere, just do that too. And I don't care what color the money is, what ideology the money is. Let's have those 3% interest rates from China. Let's have 0% interest rates from the IMF. If you're low income, it's 0%. It's like, why would you not borrow from the IMF? It's a brilliant idea. And where I think it's distressing is when you are being misled. So the elites in the Francophone countries, they're not leaving. These guys who took over in the coups 2-3 years ago now, they haven't left the CFA yet. That's funny. Why not? Because they know, everyone knows. Every businessman and politician I've spoken to in the Francophone countries says, no, of course we're going to keep the peg.
Wow.
But I said, why don't you go out on the radio and
say that
to people? Well, the people don't, what do they say? I mean, I don't know. They don't do it. They don't do it. They don't feel they need to do it.
But why don't they? Because I think the public, they have a very different perception to the CFA franc. I mean, I think Alex and I have had conversations, and we've spoken to people about this, and we've received like hostile pushbacks saying, "Oh no, this is imperialism. Colonialism hasn't gone anywhere." But just suggesting that no, the CFA franc has some advantages. So I think it's a very important message.
No, I do. I mean, what's one of the most successful economies in Asia is Hong Kong. It's had a peg like forever. I actually thought I find interesting about the peg. The Francophone peg is actually it's the same as the gold standard. And the gold standard is what Europe developed off the back of. It didn't give us more savings because we had too high a fertility rate. So we had to send our excess people across to America or South Africa or wherever they went. But at least it gave us interest rate stability. And that helps, I think, on average. I mean, I think there's almost a case to say that Nigeria should kind of go and adopt the gold standard, or weirdly. I think there's a case for it. So actually, I'd go almost the opposite. More countries should be going back to currency colonial pegs because it helps give you that low inflation and that stability that helps encourage a bit of investment. But if you haven't educated your people, it makes no point. And so if you're in Burkina or Mali, these guys don't. I mean, I have now published the book in French. It's like on much cheaper. I self-published it, so it's probably got horrible translation errors, but it's much cheaper on Kindle, Amazon.France, and the hope that people might get to read this and start to popularize a different point of view on it. Because I do think it would help to say, look, this isn't our fight. We shouldn't be fighting about the currency regime, which is giving us low interest rates. We should be fighting the lack of education in our country. What is going on there? I have this argument with Pakistan a lot as well, because that's.
But these governments, they lack the resources to even perhaps implement educating, or
Yep.
do you not agree with that?
No. Sadly, that is very true. So there's a lovely bloke called Guido Moore who works at the Centre for Global Development. And he used to be Liberia's infrastructure minister. And he pointed that out to me. I said, no, so I said, what you need to do is you need to make sure that mothers and babies are not dying, because then you have high fertility, and you need to be doing adult education classes in the evenings maybe. And, he says, Charlie, so which one do we do? I'm the minister. I've got enough electricity to either power the hospital or power the classroom.
Wow.
Both. He said, not possible. What are you going to do? So no, there's a real problem. So that's where I've come in and said, all this aid stuff, and Deb Biso, did that book years ago, Dead Aid. I don't know if you came across it anyway. It's a great book. I mean, it's good, again, a good read. But I actually just think any aid, if it was helping on education, helping fill a gap a government can't fully fill, is a good thing. So unfortunately, what's happened with the USA this year is
quite sad.
Is really, really quite sad. And I'm not talking about, I know that a chunk of that money ended up being spent on the consultants who were giving the advice and not actually going, I know some of that will have definitely be true. But nonetheless, I think it was making a difference.
I sort of think a lot gets lost because a lot of people's ideas about Africa, they get lost in this very conspiratorial sort of narratives. I mean, even Bill Gates, people detest his work in Africa. When I think objectively, what he's doing is good. I mean, he's providing vaccines and he's set up across the continent. He's clearly a force for good, but people say, oh no, he's taking over, or he's poisoning the babies and on all these things. And it's just, I feel Africa gets lost in that time and time again.
And I wish that we didn't see exactly the same conspiratorial nonsense in America itself about what's going on, and Europe, and I find all of that sort of thing quite bizarre. But no, there are certain things, again, we know that if you are not seeing your kids die in childbirth or in the few years afterwards, you tend to have smaller families. There's a very strong correlation. Works everywhere. And we see it in our own families. I mean, anyone, my family, you go back 4 generations and 8 kids, 2 died before they were 10. That's why they had 8 kids in part. Yeah. And the number of times in my family tree I could see a name which is exactly the same as some kid who was born 5, 10, 15 years before, because that kid didn't make it. Wow. And so they just have another one and even give it the same name. It's just, they weren't very original in my family. But you've seen that we've all been through this. And I bet you there was conspiracy theorists would have been anti-Bill Gates back in 1880s England as well.
Yeah.
There's something I don't understand, and it's kind of fundamental to what you're talking about. How does, I get how, lower fertility, smaller families will lead to families having more money, but how does that translate to then the government having bigger savings or lower interest rates?
It's the family doesn't keep its money under the mattress. Every family does buy a nice house and maybe save a bit in gold if you live in India and dollars if you live in lots of other countries. But most of that cash doesn't live under your mattress because you're already getting stolen. So you put it into a bank. And that's what drove 50% of the increase, more than half of the increase in China, as I said. More than half of the increase in the savings in the whole Chinese banking system was because of the one-child policy.
Interesting. So basically, the banking system is grown through families putting in money into the banking system, which they didn't have the ability to do so because they were spending money on their kids.
Because they spent everything. Because on a Friday night, you've literally got nothing left, and you're probably going to your brother or cousin who's got 2 or 3 kids and saying, please lend me. You literally haven't got any money at the end of the week. So there's nothing to go into the bank. This is why microfinance has taken off so well in India and Bangladesh, but not in Africa. In India and Bangladesh, microfinance works very well because actually the women only have 2 kids, which basically means first they've got a bit of spare cash anyway at the end of the week, so they can often pay back the microfinance loan. Secondly, they've got time to work because they've only got 2 kids and they're probably at school most of the time. So they've got time to work, and you can then create a business. Too many countries in sub-Sahara where people have still got 4, 5, 6 kids, women haven't got the spare capacity to fund that alone if anything goes wrong, because they've got 4, 5, 6 kids to feed, and they don't have the same amount of time to work.
So Kenya, for example, you mentioned they're on 3, maybe.
Yeah, they're at 3.4 kids at the moment, and they should drop below 3 by 2029.
And so has the interest rates followed and gone down?
Well, they're. I mean, this is again where you need to be able to step back. So on a 1-year view, I can't tell you whether Kenya or Nigeria might have lower interest rates. Not really. But on average, on a 5 to 10 year view, I promise you Kenya is going to have lower interest rates than Nigeria. And I know the reason why. And there's nothing we can do about it. It's already decided.
Wow.
It's fact, as far as I'm concerned. So we do see that. So the reason Morocco's sitting there at 2, went up to 3 or 4%, I think, a year ago. But that's as far as it went. And that's because there is volatility. You've got your normal market moves. But
so there's this optimist side and also this realistic side of your view on Africa. Well, how do you see it maybe in this next 10 years? Is there opportunity? Should people invest? Where should they invest? Where should we look at? What's the...
There's a different... I talked about this cycle. There's a cyclical time to invest anywhere. So probably gold today is not it. We're at the top of a cycle that we haven't seen since 1980. I don't know when it starts going down. But
so you don't invest in gold?
Gold average price in today's money for the last 50 years has been $1,300, $1,300. We're at $3,300.
Okay.
Now, we've been through cycles before, and there's the top of the cycle. There's always a narrative to explain why it's different this time. And then it's different this time because everybody's going to invade. China's going to invade Taiwan. And when China invades Taiwan next year, this is the narrative, or 2 years' time, then America's going to freeze all its foreign assets, all of its US Treasury bonds. And the Chinese have got $3 trillion of reserves, and a lot of them are in America. So the Chinese have to buy as much gold as they can now because the Americans can't freeze that with sanctions. And then China can invade Taiwan. So China's going to buy so much gold in the next 2 years. And if the Chinese are going to buy gold, it's a huge economy, second biggest economy. If they're going to buy, everyone else will pile in because somebody's buying gold whatever the price because they're going to go and invade Taiwan. That's the narrative. Now, the narrative was different 40 years ago. The narrative was we'd lost control of inflation. US couldn't control inflation. Nothing was going to get inflation under control. Gold price was at record highs, the equivalent of about $3,000 in today's money. And then it turns out the Americans could control inflation and the gold price crumbled. And that is something we are likely to see over 5 to 10 years. The gold price a lot lower than it is today. Same thing happens with markets. So 6 months ago, African markets were the cheapest they have been in 20 years, since 2002, relative to developed markets. Everybody wants to own NVIDIA, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Tesla sometimes. Everybody wants to own that. Nobody wants to own an African bank or somebody trying to sell oil out of Nigeria. It's just zero interest. I've never seen, most of my clients have seen their funds close down in the last 10 years. The dollar's been getting stronger. America's been fantastic. It's the one place you could trust. You knew what you were with when you invested in America. It's always going to win. Which is exactly the same narrative as 20 years ago, by the way. 20 years ago, tech was amazing. America was the place to be. And then we had the tech bubble deflate. And then we had the global financial crisis. American banks becoming virtually valueless. And by 2012, it was like emerging markets is the best place to be. So we're in a cycle. We've been in a cycle, and the cycle turned, I think, 6 months ago. So now the very cheapest things on the planet you can buy are probably in Africa. So cyclically, you buy it for 5, 10 years. Structurally, that doesn't mean in 10 years when everyone said, my goodness, look at the growth rate we've just had in Africa. Look how fantastically well the price of everything I owned 10 years ago. I bought them in 2025 and God, it's been great. And Africa's going to the moon. Then you sell. Because structurally, we haven't addressed all of the issues. We haven't sorted out all of the saving shortages and It'll look like we have. It'll look like we'll be so close to it all coming good. And then you've got to be a bit more cautious again.
Wow.
But right now, there's a lot of interesting opportunities now.
Well, I do have to say, Charlie, when we first heard your theory, it was pretty,
You're buzzing.
Buzzing. What is this? But it does seem pretty convincing. And maybe we can end on this. Do you have any advice for us? Maybe we potentially want to do stuff in Africa, or I guess anywhere in the world. Like we're young economists. What advice do you have for us?
It depends whether you want a really interesting life or you want a very successful and easy life.
Well, I guess it depends what you.
Those two things don't go together.
Let's go for the. Let's go for both.
Let's go for both.
No. I don't think you can have both. So I think
like the Libyan. Let's choose the first one, the interesting life.
Like the interesting life is going to continue to be this continent because it's going to create the biggest variation. You're going to see countries like Mauritius just getting richer and older, and they are getting older actually, richer and older and kind of more boring every year, in a good way. And you're going to see this industrializing story, and then you're going to see another one in Kenya in 5 years' time, and in 10 years' time after that, Ghana's going to be coming along, and it's going to be, and then you'll see it in Nigeria. Lagos will lead it, and there's going to be so many interesting stories at the same time. You'll be able to go to Niger, which hasn't changed in 2,000 years, and will not be any different in 10 years' time than it is today. Not really. So you're going to have the most extraordinary variation of experiences and the ability to say, well, I've seen this in Morocco. I know how that's going to play out roughly in Kenya. And this is now going to transfer to Ghana. And through the course of your career, you'll be able to take these experiences and go, wow. But if you want an easy life, where you get paid lots of money for the work, same amount of work, Asia is going to be it. India is going to boom for the next 30, 40 years. And they're going to grow at 7 or 8% a year. And let's say 6, 7, 8, but still, it's going to be great. They'll have a couple of dips along the way and it'll be, it's the end of the Indian miracle. We saw that with Asia in the 1990s, but it will carry on. So that will and there's 1.5 billion people there, huge market. And they don't annoy the Americans yet.
Okay. And Charlie, sorry, last one. If there was one thing you could say to yourself when you were starting your career, or if there's anything that you could change, what would it be?
Just spend 6 months doing Excel spreadsheet, learning how to use an Excel spreadsheet better. I could have sped up my life so much.
I've been avoiding using Excel.
That's as an economist. Hopefully, AI is going to replace that problem, and you won't need to do it. Just be AI, sort this out, and give me the formula.
Okay.
And that it'll also. I'm praying that happens because even now it would speed up my life dramatically.
So it's even a bit of a ball ache now.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Really annoying.
Wow.
Just takes me far too long because
Okay.
I never spent 1 month probably just doing Excel course on. Anyway, that's just me. Language would also have been a lovely thing to have learned. So I don't think.
Any specific language?
For me, it obviously would be French because of the Francophone story in Africa.
Okay.
And I just cannot. I'm never going to be as good as other economists because I don't have the language.
Okay.
I'm never going to be as well-informed, plugged in. That's a shame.
It's not bad. You still produce time
you got
traveling
your book in
economists.
French, and you got.
That's true.
Caused quite the kerfuffle at
Yeah.
so yeah,
Very
doing
good.
all right.
But Charlie, thank you so much.
Thank you ever so
Pleasure.
much. An
Thank you for all
absolute
the time.
privilege.